Good morning, welcome back. Today is November 13th, and I'm sad to say it is getting on toward that time of the year when we're not going to be able to meet out here on the deck like we have been, because as beautiful a day as it is out here, it is, what's the word I'm looking for? Chilly. So this may be the last Sunday we do this, out here at least, but I don't know, we'll see. But what happened on this date? Well, let's think about it. First of all, it was on this date in 387 that Monica died, Saint Monica. Monica is better known as being Augustine of Hippo's mother. She's the one that prayed for him daily. The legend is that she prayed every day and cried over him. And so she's been sainted for, several centuries now. But she's not the first saint that we're going to be talking about today, but she died on this date in 387. On this date in 619 AD, the Second Church Council at Seville opened up, began, and it went on for quite some time and discussed a lot of things. Among those things are, number one, that baptism only required a single dipping. I know I've mentioned in other previous classes or previous times that in the early church that if you were going to be baptized, generally speaking, it was a 3-time forward kind of baptism, but after the Second Council of Seville, they determined that a 1-time backwards baptism was appropriate. Of course, then they went into infant baptism, but that's a whole other discussion. And also they decided at that particular church council that hymns not drawn directly from scriptural text, most notably those written by St. Ambrose, were appropriate for singing in church. Now, although this church council made this decision, there were some, especially within the Protestant community, that went several centuries before really catching up with this. And in fact, in the 18th century, one of the great contributions of songwriters like Isaac Watts, who is not the last songwriter we're going to talk about today, were able to get hymns and spiritual songs and all that were not directly based on scripture. In 1644, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law against Baptists, calling them troublers of churches. And I just get a kick out of that. I think I may just start renaming this whole session I'm doing to the Troubler of Churches session. And they were punished with banishment. So if you were a Baptist in 1644 and showed up in Massachusetts, they would kick you out as being a troubler of the church. In 1874, a cabinet maker and hymn writer Edward Mote died. I know some of you are saying, who's Edward Mote? Well, since you asked, he's the guy that wrote, amongst many other poems, the song lyrics that went to what we call the hymn, The Solid Rock. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. But I think it's interesting that Mr. Mote is referred to as both a cabinet maker and a hymn writer. But he died on this date in 1874. And finally, it was on this date in 1938 that Pope Pius XI beatifies Frances Xavier Cabrini. Now, Frances Cabrini was a woman, Italian-born, who came to the United States and founded the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart. She basically did ministry to the poor in New York and Chicago, founded many hospitals, including Columbia Hospital in Chicago, which closed down a few years ago. Now, interesting, so she was ultimately canonized in 1946 and became the first U.S. citizen. She was Italian-born, but she was naturalized in 1909. So she was the first U.S. citizen to become a saint in the Catholic Church. But she was beatified on this day. But a couple of things about that. Okay, first of all, when she died at Columbia Hospital in Chicago, and in her room where she died and where she had stayed had been turned into a shrine, and became a shrine certainly after she was fully canonized in 1946. However, the hospital was torn down in 2002, but the room where she had lived was not, because it was actually it wasn't actually in the hospital. It was on the hospital complex, but technically it was a separate piece of land. Although the hospital was torn down, the big condo apartment complex was built there. But the shrine is still there. It's still open and still available to go look at. So there's a shrine to Francis Cabrini. And for those of us who live in the Chicago area, yes, indeed, the Cabrini Green housing projects were named after her, at least half of them. Cabrini, the Cabrini part. Green was a labor leader, but those were also torn down. But it was on this date in the 1938 that she was beatified by Pope Pius XI, which is the penultimate step in becoming a saint in the Catholic Church. You're beatified, they verify. There are 5 steps to become a saint, 4, depending on whether you count dying as one of the steps or not. And that is you're identified as a servant of God. That means somebody says, hey, this person needs to be sainted. And so then they kind of do an investigation, a discussion, and then you become venerated. So you become a venerable something. And then once they verify that a miracle has been done in your name, then you become beatified. And then once they verify that a second miracle has been done in your name, then you become canonized and you become a saint. And of course, the Catholic Church would just say it isn't a process that you work through, it's just simply a way of identifying what's already true. And so she was beatified in 1938, canonized in 1946. So that's it for today. Today we're going to get into Paul's first missionary journey. Okay, this is with Paul and Barnabas, and kind of kicks off the main part of the second half of the book of Acts. That is where Paul is ultimately going to end up taking the gospel all the way to Rome. So let's get out of the cold and start talking about that. Good morning, welcome back. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the writings of Luke, and we're getting into what most people, I shouldn't say most people, but what several consider to be the start of the second half of the book. It's not really, the first half of the book, or Luke kind of divides Acts into, in my opinion, 3 general parts. There's the proto-church part, which is chapters 1 through 10. And then there's the Paul and Peter part, which is the chapters 11 through, I'd say, 15. And then from about chapter 16 on, and these are inexact, it's like all Paul. Very few of the rest of the epistles, or the rest of the book deals with any other of the apostles. But today we're going to talk about Paul's first missionary journey. Now, again, remember when we're talking about Paul, when he first appears in Acts chapter 9, he's called Saul, and generally it's believed that that's his Hebrew name, but his Greek name, Gentile name, would be Paul. There is no indication in the Bible that there was any great name-changing moment for him. It's just a question of, because he dealt mostly with Gentiles and non-Jewish, he referred to himself by his Greek name again, which is Paul. So Saul, Paul, whatever. We're so used to talking about it, you kind of forget that point. And then I saw something, I don't know whether something on some social media site where somebody was announcing that Paul's name is never changed as some great expose on Christianity. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know that that's really a hill that anybody is going to die on. And for what it's worth, it's not. But so in our last time together, we were talking about chapter 11 and 12, and we talked about the church in Antioch, that is Antioch in Syria, which is north of Jerusalem. It is not Jewish. Now, it's Roman. It's under control of the Roman Empire, but it's not a Jewish city. There are quite a few Jews there. There's quite a church presence there. And then in 11 and 12, chapter 12, we had Peter's release from prison. And then we had the death of Herod the Great there at the end of chapter 12. So I'm going to pick up today actually at the very end of chapter 12. That is chapter 12, verse 25, because that leads us into Paul's first missionary journey. And again, one of the things to remember is that chapters and verses, this is a side note, pet peeve of mine, chapters and verses are not, the chapter and verse divisions are not inspired. And so, as handy as they are for us to be able to find particular elements or particular verses or passages or words, it does sometimes cause arbitrary divisions. And so the story changes at the end of chapter 12, beginning with verse 25. And so that's where we're going to pick it up today as we get into talking about how the gospel got to Rome. So in verse 25, it says, "When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark." Now their mission, as you may recall, was noted in chapter 11, verse 30. If you remember prophets, notably one named Agabus, who will return later on, had come in and said there was going to be a famine. And so the disciples there in Antioch said, well, let's take up an offering for our there's going to be a famine in Judea, and they said, let's take up an offering, and we'll send it to Jerusalem by way of Barnabas and Saul. And so they do. And so Barnabas and Saul go to Jerusalem. There's no story here in Acts. I think there's a couple of other points in one of Paul's epistles, some of Paul's epistles, where he makes reference to meeting with the apostles, the 12, and something that may have happened here, but we don't really know. We just know that in verse 25 they're finished and they've come back. Okay, so they've come back. Now, verse 1, "In the church in Antioch there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, who we've already met, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul." So this particular church had these prophets, prophets and teachers, and a prophet, could have been like Agabus, somebody who had that foretelling capability, gift that was very prevalent in the Old Testament. We don't see it quite as much, but we do see it here in the book of Acts. Agabus, of course, is one of them, and it doesn't distinguish whether Paul is a prophet or a teacher or they're both, and kind of just say, hey, they had these two guys or two groups, and we had these few individuals. It says, "While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Okay. Interesting side note here. Notice Barnabas' name comes first. Is that significant? Well, perhaps. But be that as it may, in fact, Barnabas is the first listed there beginning in verse 1, as far as who the prophets and the teachers were. And again, Barnabas is a great guy. I mean, back in Jerusalem, remember, he's the one that had sold a piece of land and put the money at the apostles' feet, and then later on, he's the one that goes and gets Saul, or that testifies to Saul, and then he's the one that in Antioch goes to Tarsus to get Saul and brings him back to Antioch. And Barnabas is the one who sees something in Saul and says, this guy is good for our movement. And he brings him back, and he establishes him there at the church in Antioch, where he is for at least a year, we know from a previous passage. So now the church is fasting and praying. Don't know why, whether they're fasting according to a Jewish calendar or whether they're just eager or anxious for something, but they're fasting and praying, and they hear the word from the Holy Spirit. And here the Holy Spirit is talking to them. And again, we tend to, one of the takeaways from our look at Acts is to realize that the Holy Spirit is a person. Okay, we tend to think of the Holy Spirit, perhaps it's from our King James days of talking about the Holy Ghost. But the Holy Spirit is a person capable of communication, saying, here, separate, and he gives this word, separate to me Barnabas and Saul, because I've got something for them to do. Okay, so after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Okay, now I kind of think that they were praying about how are we going to spread the gospel. Okay, because that's exactly what, Lord, show us how we're going to spread the gospel. And the Lord's response is separate Barnabas and Saul for the work that I have. They're going to do it. Now remember what in chapter 9 when Ananias is saying, do you know who this is? And the Spirit says to Ananias, hey, don't worry, this is my guy that's going to reach the Gentiles. Okay, so maybe they're just kind of, the Spirit is just fulfilling that. So beginning in verse 4, Barnabas and Saul, joined by John Mark, who they had come back from Jerusalem with. Okay, I didn't mention that earlier in verse 25, take off on Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey. Now, right here, I'm going to put a map up of, here it is, this is the route. I don't expect you to do that. I mean, I've got it right here. This is like the poor man's version of the whiteboard. I should make this kind of like a thing behind me, so that I could just turn around and say they went from here to here. But this is sort of a map of their direction. And it starts in Antioch. Now, interestingly enough, it never goes into a Jewish area. Okay, so there's no actual predominantly Jewish area like Israel. I mean, there are Jewish communities in each of these places where they go. But so basically the next two chapters are just a series of Paul and Barnabas went here, and here's what happened. Paul and Barnabas went here, and here's what happened. Okay, so I hope to cover this whole thing, get through chapter 13 and 14, and then next week we'll pick it up with the first Ecumenical Church Conference, the Council of Jerusalem, in Acts chapter 15. So, 13, verse 4. The two of them, sent on their way by the Holy Spirit, went down to Seleucia and sailed from there to Cyprus. Seleucia being a port city. What happened in Seleucia, we don't know. Maybe they just stayed the night, got on a boat, and took off to Cyprus. Cyprus being an island that is in the Mediterranean. When they arrived from there to Cyprus, when they arrived at Salamis, which is a city on Cyprus, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. John was with them as their helper. Okay, so again, emphasis, John is with them. This is John Mark. Tradition states that this is the same John Mark who writes the Gospel of Luke. I'm sorry, the Gospel of Mark. Okay, but this guy is with them. Okay. They traveled through the whole island until they came to Paphos. Okay, so Salamis is on the eastern side of the island, and then they travel down the entire island until they get to the western side of the island, and that's where Paphos is. So basically, Salamis is a port city on the east, and Paphos is a port city on the western side of the island. Okay. There they met a Jewish sorcerer and a false prophet named Bar-Jesus. Okay, it's interesting here to me to kind of think about this in light of Paul's experience with, Peter's experience with Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8. Remember where Simon in Samaria had been entertaining the Samaritans for years and years. Who was an attendant to the proconsul Sergius Paulus. Okay, the proconsul, an intelligent man, sent for Barnabas and Saul because he wanted to hear the word of God. So, by this point, they're already known. Barnabas and Saul already have a reputation. The word is out on the street. Maybe it's by this point. It's pretty clear that, this is that guy that years ago. So again, we're about, I think, the general idea is that this takes place around AD 46, 47, 48, somewhere in that era, which puts it about 10 or 12 years after the resurrection. Okay, so there's quite a time gap here, and when we get into the actual work of Paul. And it kind of makes sense because Paul does mention It could be more than that. Could be 48 to 50, somewhere in that era. Just because Paul does talk about in one of his epistles being 14 years. He mentions a 14-year experience there. So, but it is several years later. Paul is an established teacher in this very large, what at the time was a very large church. Barnabas, of course, is well known. And so this guy, Sergius Paulus, the proconsul, the ruler of the area, wants to meet them, wants to hear what they have to say. But Elymas, the sorcerer, for that is what his name means, that is, Elymas means sorcerer, and they talk about the sorcerer, opposed them and tried to turn the proconsul from the faith. So in other words, and the way I have this pictured is this proconsul, Sergius Paulus, hears about Paul and Barnabas and say, hey, I want to hear you. And he's got this guy, sort of like if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings, sort of like a worm tongue, kind of whispering in his ears, no, that can't be true, that can't be true. But and so Paul and Barnabas are presenting the gospel to this leader. And I think this is kind of a first example of Paul talking to these leaders, because as you go through, especially later in the 21, 2, 3, 4, past chapter 20, Paul is forever talking to Festus, Felix, Agrippa, these guys. So he's always presenting the gospel to these religious leaders, or these political leaders. Okay. Then Saul, who is also called Paul, now here we see it's kind of a dual name thing. Okay. It isn't that, like when Jesus meets Simon, not Simon from Acts chapter 8, but Simon, I'm going to call you Peter. There's a clear name change here. This is just simply a dual name. You could say Saul, Paul, same person. But then Saul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked straight at Elymas and said, you are a child of the devil and an enemy of everything that is right. You are full of all kinds of deceit and trickery. Will you never stop perverting the right ways of the Lord? Now the hand of the Lord is against you. You are going to be blind for a time, not even able to see the light of the sun. And so Paul sees him and recognizes what he's doing, recognizes his enmity toward the gospel, and the fact that he's not a friend, that he's not there to be convinced, he's not there with an open mind. Whether he is in fact demonic or not, we don't really know. He's just a bad guy, okay? But he pronounces this on him just to show who's in charge here, okay? That you've got your spirit, Elymas, I've got mine, and you're going to be blind. I'm going to give away this vision that you have. And so, this false prophet, a false prophet would be somebody who would claim to have vision of the future, and Paul kind of gets him right there. And it's ironic, isn't it, that Paul is giving through the Spirit, of course, Paul is giving to Elymas the same opportunity that he was given. Okay, so what happened to Paul? Saul was going to Damascus, and he was going to pervert the ways of the way. And a huge bright light comes down, and he's blinded. And he's got time to think about this. Okay, and regardless of whether he was converted at that first blinding moment, by the time the 3 days were over, Paul had converted, I think, had really come to understand that Jesus was the Messiah. And I think perhaps in a certain extent, Paul is offering the same opportunity to Elymas. Maybe Paul is saying, yeah, I was like you. I was, an enemy of the way, and this worked for me. I hope it's going to work for you. Immediately, mist and darkness came over him, and he groped about, seeking someone to lead him by the hand. When the proconsul saw what had happened, he believed, for he was amazed at the teaching about the Lord. Now, this is interesting because this is Paul's first encounter with the Roman/Gentile that we have. Okay, And so it's interesting that this guy believes. We believe he's a Gentile. I mean, he's a Roman leader, so that kind of says he's of the Gentile persuasion. But this is the first time, and Paul sees this belief happen. Okay, and now this is well past the time that Peter is at Cornelius's house. So I think this is one of those things that perhaps Paul knew in his head, and I'm speculating here. Paul knew it in his head that, yeah, the gospel is available for Gentiles as well, but maybe this was the first time that he'd actually seen it. He's like, whoa, wait a minute, this guy's going to believe, and he's going to believe without, and Paul is seeing it. Paul is seeing this belief happen in this guy's heart, in front of him. And so maybe this is one of the reasons why Paul, is so adamant about, you don't need to follow the law because I've seen it. I've seen the belief in these guys. Okay, but so we go. So Paul has this successful encounter with Sergius Paulus, and then we move on to the next point, and that is into Pisidian Antioch. From Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. Okay, side note. This is all we know here in Acts. I'm sorry. Let me take that back. We don't know why. We don't know why John Mark leaves. Okay, we don't. Although we know from later passages, and we'll talk about this a little more extensively when we get there. But John leaves, and from the later text in chapter 15, end of chapter 15, Paul sees this as a very bad thing. Okay, Barnabas, on the other hand, not so much. Okay, or let me rephrase that. They may have both seen it as a bad thing that he was leaving, but Barnabas was able to look back on it in chapter 15 in a much kinder point of view. So we'll get more to it, but this is the point where they leave. So they barely into their first journey. Okay, they've only gotten to the first stop, or they're only at their third stop, I should say. I'm looking down at my map here. See, they've only gone from here to here. This is where they meet Sergius Paulus, and now they're up here. Okay. From Perga, they went on to Pisidian Antioch. Okay, this is a different Antioch. Okay, just like how many Springfields are there in the United States? This is Pisidian Antioch. Pisidia being an area, and Antioch being a city within that. Just like Syria is an area, a country, Pisidia or Antioch in Syria is that, in that location. On the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue and sat down. After the reading from the laws and the prophets, their leaders of the synagogue sent word to them, saying, "Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the Lord, for the people, please speak up." So again, Paul and Barnabas are known. They come walking into the synagogue. They sit down. Now, this is Paul's pretty much standard operating procedure. Wherever he goes to the synagogue first. The synagogue being the place where the Jewish believers, specifically Jewish men, would gather to study and talk about the word. Okay, and so this is his first time, or the first time we hear about this. They walk in, they sit down, and the leaders of the synagogue recognize them. Now, it could be they recognize them as who they were. Oh, that's Paul and Barnabas from the church in Antioch. Or it could be that they just recognize them as being teachers, preachers. Something about them made them think that, oh, these guys have something. Because a message is sent, brothers, like to both of them, either one of them. So maybe at this point they're not distinguishing between Paul and Barnabas. Perhaps this is a much more equal partnership than we like to think. I mean, we emphasize Paul, but perhaps this is more a far more equal partnership than commonly thought. Simply because of how much more significant Paul becomes in the writings of Luke. Okay, but he says, "Brothers, you have," and then it says Paul stands up. Now, this may or may not be unusual. Usually, the person speaking would be sitting, but Paul decides to take the lead here and stands up, motioned with his hand, and says, Fellow Israelites and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me. Okay, and now here we have Paul's first sermon. Okay, this is delivered in Pisidian Antioch. It's going to sound real familiar to us, especially if you remember our discussion on Stephen's sermon. But keep in mind, he needs to set the stage for these, and these are Jewish believers. Now there are some apparently Gentile converts, Jewish proselytes in the audience, because he says, "You Jewish believers." Okay, so fellow Israelites, and let's go through Paul's sermon real quick. The God of the people of Israel chose our ancestors. He made the people prosper during their stay in Egypt. With mighty power, he led them out of the country. For about 40 years, he endured their conduct in the wilderness. I just like that phrase. He endured their conduct. Okay. And he overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, giving their land to his people as their inheritance. All this took about 450 years. This from the, and again, let's not get lost in the details. Was it 449 years? Was it 450 years? Was it from this point? It was about 450 years. Okay. After this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul, son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. After removing Saul, he's just blasting through. He's just kind of laying out the groundwork here real quick. He's talking to the choir. He's talking to people who already agree with him. Okay, and he knows it. So he just wants to kind of hit the high points and move on. He made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Now, this is actually a conflation. He's putting together a couple of verses. Psalm 8, 1 Samuel 13. And just a side note about David, and this phrase, a man after God's own heart. Okay, this is something that the Lord said of David prior to David's becoming king. Okay, and I just say that, and again, this is like way off the topic, but every once in a while, somebody will do a series on David or preach a sermon on David, and if it's David in his later years, especially after Bathsheba and all of that, they'll say, "Oh, David, a man after God's own heart," and it's like, okay, at one time, God recognized him as a man after his own heart. Maybe not so much when he's with Bathsheba or in later years. Okay, just kind of a thought that was something he said. It could, but it does not necessarily apply. The text doesn't demand that it apply to David at every stage in his life. Okay, he will do everything I want him to do. From this man's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Savior Jesus as he's promised. Now here this is where he steps over the line. Okay, what I mean by that is this is where Paul goes from traditional Judaism into the way. Okay, before the coming of Jesus, John preached repentance and baptism to all the people of Israel. As John was completing his work, he said, "Who do you suppose I am? I am not the one you're looking for, but there is one coming after me whose sandals I am not worthy to untie." Okay, so again, going back to John's baptism, and I remember we talked about it, we said that John's baptism, in my opinion, John's baptism was simply the purification of the Jewish religion. In other words, it's like, okay, Jews, we missed the point. We've gone off this way. This is a corrective. This is a change of direction, which is what a baptism. I'm not going to follow Judaism in this direction. We're going to follow it in this direction, and then that leads to Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, but you still have to go from John's baptism. It's a correction of Judaism, but you still have to go from John's baptism to faith in Jesus. Okay. Fellow children of Abraham and you God-fearing Gentiles, it is to us that this message of salvation has been sent. And I think when he says to us, he's referring to himself and Barnabas. Okay? He could be talking about the whole Jewish nation, though. I mean, again, it's not clear because he's talking to the group. Excuse me. It's not clear that he's talking to the entire group here. I think he's just referring to Barnabas. He and Barnabas, right there.
The people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus, yet in condemning him, they fulfilled the words of the prophets that are read every Sabbath. Probably just like was read in there. Though they found no proper ground for a death sentence, they asked Pilate to have him executed. When they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead. Now, keep in mind, this is 10 or 15 years after the resurrection. Okay? So it could be that the story, Paul is just bringing all of this just stuff up just as a quick reminder. Hey, don't forget, this is what happened. But here, just in case you did, this is how it went. Maybe it's old news. Maybe they've forgotten about it. Okay? I find that if I start talking about a political event that happened 10 years ago, I tend to get a lot of blank looks where people going, wait, did that really happen? Yeah, let me remind you of it and why it's significant today. And I think that's what Paul is kind of getting across. When they had they laid him in a tomb, verse 30. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people. It's kind of interesting that when Peter talks about the resurrection, he always said, we are witnesses. Paul is not a witness to the resurrection here. So I know I mentioned earlier, did Paul ever see Jesus? Maybe during his earthly ministry he did, but I don't think Paul was one of the ones that Jesus appeared to, because otherwise he would have said, I am a witness of this as well. They are now witnesses to our people, okay? We tell you the good news. We tell you the gospel. We're here to tell you this good news. What God promised our ancestors, he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. And now he's going to get into the doctrinal proof, okay? And this is very similar to what Peter preached in Acts chapter 2. The logic is very similar to what Peter preached in Acts chapter 2, as well as the logic that Stephen does in Acts chapter 6. As it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I become your father. God raised him from the dead so that he will never be subject to decay. As God has said, I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David. So it is stated elsewhere, you will not let your Holy One see decay. Okay, remember at Pentecost, Peter's talking about that David's buried over there and his body's decayed, so it can't be talking about David. Okay. Now when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep, he was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. Okay, so again, very similar to what Peter had said. But the one whom God raised from the dead did not see decay, therefore he's the Holy One, therefore he's the one that fulfills the prophecy, he's the one that is the next step after John's baptism. Therefore, my friend, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Not through, at this point, not through sacrifice, not through obeying the Jewish law, but through Jesus. Okay, so this ultimate sacrifice. So, whereas prior to the resurrection, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the forgiveness of sins was seen through the acceptance of a sacrifice, of a temporary sacrifice that only covered, it was a temporal thing. It covered the sins of the day, and up until the next time you were out of luck, okay? Through him, everyone who believes is set free from every sin. Okay, again, and it isn't that sin doesn't have the hold on you. I think he's talking about the consequences of them, the eternal consequences. A justification you were not able to obtain under the law of Moses. And who would know better than Paul, a Pharisee? Okay. Take care that what the prophets have said does not happen to you. Okay. You scoffers, wander and perish, for I am going to do something in your days that you would never believe, even if somebody told you. And this is a passage from Habakkuk. And the thought here is that don't underestimate the message. Don't discount what I'm telling you. As Paul and Barnabas were leaving the synagogue, now this doesn't cause as big a row here as it does in other places. As Paul and Barnabas were leaving the synagogue, the people invited them to speak further about these things on the next Sabbath. When the congregation was dismissed, many of the Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who talked with them and urged them to continue in the grace of God. This is over the course of the next 7 days. However, it doesn't go quite so well the next time they go back into the synagogue. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. When the Jews saw the crowd, they were filled with jealousy. So again, not everybody was interested in it. Not everybody believed Paul. Not everybody was willing to take that step. Okay? And then all of a sudden, over 7 days, the buildup had been that, hey, these guys have a really great message you want to hear. And so the Jews saw the crowd, they were filled with jealousy. They began to contradict what Paul was saying and heaped abuse on him. Okay? So again, you've got hecklers in the crowd, you've got people disagreeing with him, you've got people talking, no, that's not true. They began to contradict what Paul was saying and heaped abuse on him. So at the second week, the first week went pretty well, but the second week, Paul realizes these guys aren't buying it. They're not buying what I'm saying, okay? Then Paul and Barnabas answered them boldly. We had to speak the word of God to you first, that is to the Jewish community. Since you reject it and do not consider yourselves worthy of eternal life, so apparently you guys don't want to be saved, we now turn to the Gentiles. Okay? For this is what the Lord has commanded us. I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation upon the end of to the end of the earth. And of course, this is from Isaiah 49. And so Paul is saying, listen, guys, if you don't want this, I'm going to go talk to the Gentiles about it. This is an offer I've made to you. You are rejecting it. I'm going to turn to the Gentiles. And Isaiah 49 is my impetus for this. Now, again, the Jewish nation, and I don't have the time to go into this, but the Jewish nation had always been, the goal of the Jewish nation was always that they would bring the message of God to the nations. Okay? This kind of got lost. Okay? I've been listening to a series of historical lessons from Ray Bakke, who is instrumental in the founding of the university that I'm attending right now, Bakke Graduate University. But he was talking about the Jewish nation confusing chosenness with favoritism. That they figured that because God chose Israel, that Israel was God's favorite people. But they were chosen for a reason, and the reason was they were supposed to bring the message to the nations, a job that they didn't do a really good job of. And now Paul is saying, listen, okay, if you don't want this message, I'm going to take it to the Gentiles. Okay. Now, side note, some people look at this and say, well, this is the start of the Gentile mission. Okay, this is it. This is the start of the Gentile mission right here, when the Jews in Antioch, Pisidia reject Paul's message. Okay, and it could be. The trouble is, there's a couple of other times in Acts where Paul says something very similar. Okay, but you can look at this and say this is it, and that's fine. Just this is where the Gentile mission starts. When the Gentiles heard this, they were glad and honored the word of the Lord, and all who were appointed for eternal life believed. Okay, let me make another note here. Within the broad Christian community, there are two views as far as salvation in the world of salvation history and how salvation works. And one of them is referred to as generally as Calvinism, and one of them is referred to as Arminianism. Now, these are both very broad spectrums. Okay, and there are, even within each of them, there's a spectrum. You know, some people are further this way or that way, and further this way or that way. Okay, and there are passages in the Bible that support one. And one of the key elements of Calvinism has to do with, and there's 5 of them, the tulip. Some of you know what I'm talking about. But one of the ideas of Calvinism is that there's a certain number of people that are appointed to be saved. They are called the elect. And they're going to get saved regardless of what you do or not. Okay, and because they can't resist it, irresistible grace. Okay, and this verse is one of the texts that sometimes is used to support that, because it says all those who were appointed to be saved, or all those who were appointed for eternal life believed. Okay, that is God going in knew who was going to be appointed. Paul made a speech, and the Lord knew that 27 of these guys were going to tell Paul that they believed. We're going to make a profession of faith. And before Paul left, 27 of them came forward and said, "Yes, I believe." Okay, I'm just telling you that's one of the usages for this verse. Okay, we're going to come back to this topic later because there's another passage as well. Verse 49, back to the text. The word of the Lord spread through the whole region, but the Jewish leaders incited the God-fearing women of high standing and the leading men of the city. They stirred up persecution against Paul and expelled them from their region. So they shook the dust off their feet as a warning to them and went to Iconium. And the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Okay, so again, to shake the dust off, this is very similar to the message that Jesus gave in Luke chapter 9, that if they accept your city, go into a city. If they accept you, stay there. If they don't, wipe the dust off your feet and walk away. Okay, so Paul is like, okay, that's it. We are walking away from Antioch of Pisidia, and we are going on to Iconium. But those that were, and again, verse 52, and the disciples, and I believe those are the believers left in Antioch of Pisidia, were filled with the Holy Spirit. Okay, so now they go to Iconium, which is another town. Now this is in the area of Galatia, where Paul is going to write Galatians, which many believe is one of Paul's first earlier epistles. But this is all in the area of Galatia here. Okay, at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. Now, see, here's the problem with saying that Acts chapter 13 and Antioch Pisidia is the start of the Jewish mission, because the Gentile mission, because the first thing Paul and Barnabas do at the next place is they go to the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively. Chapter 14, verse 1. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Okay, so there are Jews who don't believe, aren't buying it. And so they go to the Gentiles who don't believe and say, hey, we got to get rid of these guys. These guys are trouble. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. Okay, this is getting back to another running thought throughout the book of Acts, and that is that the gifts of signs and wonders are kind of leading edge indicators that when the gospel is first going into a community, a people group, that you have this ability, you see signs and wonders occurring. That once the gospel is established in a community, you see signs and wonders dissipating. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. Okay. Now, 14:4, hold that thought. This is the first time that Paul in Luke is referred to as an apostle. Okay. Hold that thought. There was a plot afoot among both Gentiles and Jews together with their leaders to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. Okay, so they get into Iconium. They're doing well. They're having some success, but there's this conspiracy getting against them. Some believing the Jews, some believing the apostles. Oh wait, somebody's going to kill us. Let's get out of here. Verse 8. In Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. Okay, so compare this to Peter and John at the Gate Beautiful in Acts chapter 3. It's a very similar thing. Okay, so you've got a man who'd never walked, a man lame from birth. Here you have a man lame from birth. The difference in this particular story is that Paul walks and sees the man, and you have that sight thing going again, just similar with Acts chapter 3. Paul sees the man, but Paul sees something that we don't know whether Peter, and I don't think Peter did. I think in Acts chapter 3, it's Peter's faith. Here, Paul looks at the man and realizes that he's a believer, that he somehow, something about it. Is it something in his body language? Is it a lot of good positive feedback? Or is it something that the Spirit tells him? It could be either. I don't know. Okay, we don't really know. Certainly Paul was filled with the Holy Spirit, and Paul was sensitive to the Holy Spirit and working in a way that most of us have no clue within his particular being, by virtue of his being Paul, being the apostle, being in this moment, this divine mission. But he tells the man, stand up. So he tells the man, stand up, and the man stands up. and he begins to walk. He jumps up and begins to walk. And like with Acts chapter 3, with the man at the gate beautiful, this is a man who would never walk. So he did not know how to stand. He did not know how to walk. He did not know the balance of how to balance. He did not know how to put one foot in front of another. Okay, but all of that was given to him. Okay, so it wasn't just a partial healing. It was a complete healing. This man suddenly, he couldn't get a job because he couldn't walk. Now he can. He couldn't support his family. Now he can. Okay, because there was no learning curve. It was already learned. Okay, it was a complete miracle, and I think there's a good lesson there as far as, when God does a miracle, he does a complete miracle. But be that as it may, verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, because this is done in public, this is a guy who'd been there for a long time, he sees the man, he sees him talking to Paul, they see the man get up, and they realize a miracle has been done. So again, oftentimes you look in the Bible and you ask yourself, how do I know something supernatural has happened? Well, look at the reaction of the crowd. Look at what the people are saying. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Okay? Now, all of this may be happening off stage. Okay, and we'll see why. What I mean by that is Paul and Barnabas aren't seeing this. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them, okay, to the gods, Jupiter and Hermes, in the person of Barnabas and Paul. Verse 14, but when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, maybe they were at the gate and they saw this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, okay, friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human, just like you. Again, remember Acts chapter 3? What happened in Acts chapter 3? There's a crowd reaction. And Peter says in Acts 3, why do you think it's strange that Jesus can't heal this guy? Or what makes you think we did this? We didn't do this. And it's exactly the point that Paul is making. We're not gods. We didn't do this. We too are only humans like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Okay. Now, fascinating, couple of really interesting things about this. First of all, let's go back to the question. He talks about the apostles, Barnabas, and Saul. So this is the second time. So these are the two times that Paul and Barnabas are referred to as apostles. Okay. So a couple of just interesting thoughts about this. I think that this partnership, Paul and Barnabas partnership, is far more equal than perhaps we think. We always think of Paul and his sidekick Barnabas. It wasn't. Okay, it was a very equal. These two guys are, equal, equal in terms of influence here. Okay, but again, this is the only time in Acts that Paul is referred to as an apostle, and some have taken this element, okay, because the word apostle at its root means sent one. Okay, and some have looked at this and said, okay, so in later Gospels, in the epistles, when he talked about the offices, and he talked about apostles, that the current idea, and by current I mean like 21st century idea of what an apostle is someone who is sent or a missionary. That the apostolic office, what was the apostolic office here in the first century church, is now the role of the missionary. Now, I'm just throwing that out there for you, okay? And one of the reasons why the apostles, those with the apostolic office, those with the apostolic gift, could do these miracles was because they were sent, they were leading the gospel into a community. Okay, so that's the first interesting thing. The second interesting thing about this passage is if you look at Paul's message here, okay, Paul's message is to Gentiles. He can't rely on the Jewish tradition. Okay, he can't just say the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, because these guys have no idea who Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are. Okay, he can't rely on them. And so he relies on a message that he's going to develop later in Romans, that God has provided for you even if you don't know it. Okay, he says, God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea, He let all nations go their way. He has not left them without testimony. He has shown kindness. Okay, so again, this is that the God in nature, that the natural revelation is all we, especially Romans 1 is in Psalm 139. Of course, there's another one, another passage that talks about this a lot. Verse 19, because I want to finish this. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. So think about this. These are Jews that are following Paul. Okay, they're following him. And they're like, oh, this guy, yeah, we got to go. So this is from Antioch, Pisidia, and Iconium. These are those two cities where they're following him. They converge, and they're like, we got to get. So Paul has his haters traveling around trying to, shut things down. And they won the crowd over. Okay, they stoned Paul and dragged him outside of the city, thinking he was dead. Obviously there's the irony here of Paul watching Stephen get stoned. Okay. What is Barnabas doing during this time? We don't know. Was Barnabas stoned as well? Perhaps. Was he being held? Or was, I don't know. Maybe they saw Hermit because Paul was a chief speaker. They saw Paul as the one that needed to be stoned. Whatever. They drag Paul out of the city thinking he's dead. Now, is he actually dead? Perhaps. Okay, the text doesn't demand it. The text just says they thought he was dead. But what's interesting is he gets outside of the city and maybe he was just knocked out, and he wakes up and he goes back into the city. And you think, where would you go? It's like, I went into that town and they stoned me. I would go away from the town, but he actually gets up and goes back into the town. Now, in his defense, he no doubt is going back into town with some of his allies, and of course, nobody's expecting to see him because they think he's dead. All right. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe, okay, which is the next town over. Okay, this is the end, the far point of their particular village, their particular trip. They preached in the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then, at that point, they turn on and basically retrace their steps back to Antioch of Syria. Okay. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to their faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said, and most think this is Paul and Barnabas talking. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. Okay. Now, what's interesting here is you see the beginning of a church structure. Okay, that within these communities, Paul and Barnabas are picking people and saying, okay, you're going to be the elder. And the elder is the same Greek word where we get pastor. Okay, so they appointed pastors. Okay, but it was community wide. Okay, it was geographically based. It was like, okay, within Lystra, you're going to be the pastor, or maybe you two are going to be the pastors. Okay. And so they didn't establish churches on street corners or, in storefronts or anything like, it's like, okay, you are going to be the spiritual leader here. You're going to be the one that they're going to go and ask questions of. Okay. They did that. After going through Pisidia, they came into Pamphylia, and when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. Again, this is a slightly different route, but basically it's going back again. From Italia, they sailed back to Antioch, that is Antioch of Syria, where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. Okay, so going back to where they started, that's basically what that verse is saying. On arriving there, they gathered the churches together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So they're staying a long time. Now again, keep in mind that this is an amazing moment in the Jewish salvation history, this understanding that the gospel had been given to Gentiles and that the Gentiles could have a standing with God apart from the Jewish religion. Okay, this is a radical idea to those coming out of the Jewish religion. Okay, and it is not a question that is settled for a very long time. And we're going to start getting into that next week when we talk about the Council of Jerusalem, because the more Gentiles that were coming in, it just made sense to the Jewish believers that, well, of course, they're going to want to come into all of this baggage that we have. They're going to want to take on all of that because that's part and parcel. This led us to that. So if you got here this direction, you're going to want, it's kind of weird. But next week we're going to see how the apostles, the original, at least there's 11 of them left at this point, I think, dealt with this in Acts chapter 15, the first ecumenical council, the council at Jerusalem. So thank you very much for being with me. Went a little long today, but I hope to see you again next week when we talk about Acts 15. Bye now.